All right, so I'm sitting here with Dr. Crocker at the University of Illinois Springfield, who is part of the Global Studies program at Springfield. How are you doing today?
I'm doing fine, thank you.
Thanks for joining me. So I wanted to just get into the kind of the basics and the general concept of what's going on between Russia and Ukraine and the United States, as it is constantly developing. Earlier today, Vladimir Putin released a statement about an hour before our discussion, actually saying pretty much that the United States is the one that is provoking this conflict. But when it comes to Ukraine and Russia's relationship overall, there seems to be this tension between the Western influence of Europe and the Eastern influence that kind of contributes to this conflict, not just on Russia's side, but in terms of Russia, Ukraine's internal politics. So could you kind of give a bit of background and a description, as far as you can tell, of what is at the core of this conflict?
First of all, I need to tell you that I do not specialize in this region. I specialize in Latin America, but I can give you some ideas as a professor of international relations and global studies. But it's a general background, since I'm not really familiar with this country. But essentially, the country was and has been pretty much fragmented since the Middle Ages, since the Mongol invasion, and later on, some parts of Ukraine became parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and also the Ottoman Empire, and then after World War I, it became a communist state. And after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, there was well a revolution in Ukraine and became the People's Republic of Ukraine. And after World War II, it became part of the Soviet Union. So it has been all over the place in a way, but has been part of Europe, part of Russia. And that's why probably today still you have these divisions within the country, geographically divided, the West part of Ukraine being more pro-Europe and the eastern part of Ukraine being more pro-Russia.
So to some extent, the issue is not only how Russia perceives Ukraine, but Ukraine perceives itself in terms of the domestic politics and how that extrapolates into international relations. Would you say that's an accurate description?
Yeah, that's exactly the case. Yeah.
So, and I think that's kind of what plays into not only how Russia responds and treats Ukraine, but also how Ukrainian people have reacted to their own government. For example, in 2013, they ousted their president, maybe mispronouncing Yanukovych. Thank you.
Yes.
After he opposed an association deal with the EU. I was wondering, given that he was kind of seen as a pro-Russian figure, how does Putin kind of view the loss of that kind of influence, and how does that contribute to how he is currently handling his troop movements along the Ukrainian border?
Well, first of all, I like to say and state that Ukraine is an independent country, a sovereign country, so they should have the right to decide their future, whether to be with the EU, whether to be with NATO. It shouldn't be part of Russian decision making of what to do with Ukraine. This is a sovereign country, it's a internationally recognized sovereign country. And as such, will have the right to decide for themselves. So what happened is after Yanukovych decided to, in a way, suspend this relationship with Europe, that there was an internal revolution. Many pro-European Ukrainians rose up, and Yanukovych had to resign. But then after that, it was a year later, Russia responded by invading Crimea, which used to be part of Ukraine and now is under the occupation of Russia. And also initiated up to 2014 this war in Dover, which is a region, the eastern region of Ukraine, maintaining this conflict until today in the eastern part of Ukraine. So and also what happened in 2018, because now the people living in the eastern part of Ukraine seems like they're not voting in the legislative elections anymore. So there is a much more pro-European parliament in Kiev today. They voted in 2019 to join NATO, and this probably led to a reaction by Russia.
So, and that's kind of where I wanted to lead into a little bit here, because one of the arguments that Putin has made in terms of how he justifies their troop movements, while also claiming it's not for an invasion, is that the United States and other allies promised that NATO would not expand westward. Now, that's been a bit shaky factually with some historians, but I was wondering how that narrative plays into not only how the United States responds to what Russia is doing, but how the general public in Ukraine and in Russia kind of views this strife.
Well, as I said before, Ukraine is a sovereign nation, as a sovereign state, as a member of the United Nations. As such, they should have the right to decide whether to be part of NATO, whether to be part of the European Union, whether to join whoever else they want to. So I find it strange and finally illegal the fact that Russia wants to stop Ukraine from becoming a member of NATO. That should not be the case. It doesn't matter whether there was a promise or there was not a promise. It should be the right of any sovereign nation to make any decision regarding whether to join an organization or not. The issue of NATO, though, even though they were willing, there was a law passed in 2018, their willingness to join NATO, it's not going to be easy for Ukraine. It's not going to become part of NATO. Many argue that since becoming a member of NATO needs consensus, there's several members within NATO who would not really allow Ukraine to become a member, and that could probably include Germany and Hungary, among others. And so there's no such thing as consensus. So even this is not a good justification for Russia, because it's not really likely that Ukraine will become a member of NATO anyway.
Yeah, and that also assumes that Russia's intention is an invasion and not something else. I was actually recently reading an interesting piece in the New Yorker, if I recall correctly, that made the argument that that Putin's agenda might not necessarily be invasion, but the attempt to push influence further into Ukraine and get concessions as a means under the auspices of threatening an invasion. If that is the case, what is the response that Ukraine as a sovereign nation can really use to protect itself from such aggression, and other nations around it to help support that self-defense?
Well, there are two things I want to answer this question probably. One, it would be, there's such thing as in international relations, and I'm going to be teaching realism tomorrow. This theory argues for a principle called the security dilemma. So the security dilemma is when a country starts deploying soldiers, arming up, another bloc, in this case the US and the European Union, are going to think, well, what is Putin's intentions? What is he going to do? And the dilemma is, you don't know. You don't know his motivation. Nobody knows. You have to be probably in Putin's mind to know what he really wants to do. But the problem is that leads to the other bloc, the US, the European Union, NATO, with NATO to actually deploy soldiers and arm up the regions, becoming extremely dangerous game. So even if he doesn't have the intention to invade, he's creating a really, really dangerous situation. So who knows how it's going to end up.
To further add to the situation, you've got the United States, which has advisors in Ukraine at the moment, many of which are official U.S. military personnel. And both the United States and Russia are nuclear powers. Ukraine used to be a nuclear power before the Budapest Memorandum. So to some extent, there is a conflict, and let me know if you think this is incorrect, not only between the degree to which countries are trying to oppose one another, but how they go about it. For example, Russia tends to use the Wagner Group and other indirect methods of moving its forces around rather than, say, directly interfering with U.S. troops. But if there were to be some sort of direct conflict between either Ukrainian troops and Russian troops or American personnel, what do you think would be the best way forward to avoid further escalation and further violence?
I think what Biden is doing at this point is probably the best type of approach. He has a kind of a multi-dimensional approach. He is threatening with sanctions. He is also using diplomatic sources. That's number one. And Blinken, Secretary of State Blinken, he's a wonderful diplomat. So he'll be able to hopefully work things out diplomatically. I think that's the best case scenario. The sanctions may not be as, may be problematic for the rest of the world, especially for the economy. If you're sanctioning, big banks in Russia or financial institutions in Russia. I was reading in the New York Times an article yesterday saying that it would be probably difficult for the economy of the world if we decided to go after Russian banks or financial institutions. So I think the best case scenario is to resolve this issue diplomatically and absolutely last resort or hopefully not ever have any kind of military intervention.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where it's you have something where when you deploy troops, you don't know what they'll come into contact with. You don't know who's going to die, what methods are going to be used in the heat of the moment, and how that can escalate in the long term. But my final question, and I really appreciate you coming on because I know this was a bit difficult with scheduling wise, is what is the general position of the Ukrainian government and how it wants to handle its relationship with Russia and the United States from this point on, if it manages to stave off an invasion? If you could describe.
From what I heard in the last few days, I mean, it has changed. In the last few days, I guess the president has said that he would prefer not to have any military conflict, and definitely that would be favored by everyone in the world. And I think that's their position at this point. But I'm not sure. Once again, Europe seems to be more unified, especially NATO and the big countries in Europe, like the UK and France, and even Denmark and Spain have sent military help around the area. So I cannot tell you what are Ukrainians thinking right now. It would be a good another podcast for you to publish later on, and survey some Ukrainians and see what they are thinking. But I'm certain that the military conflict, it probably is very low in their scale. They want to prevent any military conflict.
Well, I'd like to thank you for joining me. I really appreciate this. And hopefully when we get some more news from the eastern border of Ukraine, it'll be that the Russian troops have removed themselves and we can have a more diplomatic approach, as you mentioned.
Yeah, hopefully. We'll see.
Hopefully, we will see.